First of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me on this webinar. I'm going to try to go over a lot of information in a short amount of time. So please stop me or send a chat a question if you want me to clarify anything. But otherwise, I'm going to go through at kind of a quick pace, and then we'll have some more time at the end for questions. For those of you who just joined, please make sure you change your chat to go to all panelists and attendees. This will make sure that everybody can see the chat, and that way if people have similar questions or want to say hi to everybody, you can say hi to more than just me. So getting started, my name is Ryan Perry. I'm the Digital Collections Librarian here at the Central New York Library Resources Council. I do this webinar every year to help folks, especially folks who have not applied for this grant before, learn a little bit of the background of the grant and hopefully result in everybody having successful, fully funded grant proposals. So again, welcome. The purpose of this webinar is to, I'm going to go over a little bit of the identifying process of how you select a project. I'm going to give some background, as I mentioned. I'm also going to go through the application really quickly and show you what questions are there and give you a few pointers along the way about what we mean by those questions. And I'm also going to go over the timeline, so what to expect and when from our process. And then another aspect that's been a popular option in the last few years is having CLRC handle your digitization and metadata projects in-house. So I'll go through that process, what it takes to get a quote, and a little bit about our workflow. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have more time for questions. Please don't hold your questions for the end. I'm going to try my best to multitask and keep track of chat while I'm talking and everything else. So please feel free to shoot a question out in chat, and I will answer it in the moment because that might be easier than going back at the end. All right, diving right in. So I haven't done this in the past in this webinar, but I want to touch really quickly on some basic project planning. This is a lot of the conversation that I have with folks when I do consultations and when I chat through like your ideas. And I think it's really important to have a pretty solid plan going into the application process and not, submitting something that's half-baked or submitting something that you haven't had a chance to think through often means that we have a lot more follow-up after the fact. So I think it's really important to consider some of these things before you even start looking at the grant application or anything else. So the first step in any project is to identify materials. So what do you have in your physical material holdings, or what do you have in your digital collections that you feel deserves a wider audience? So there are a lot of considerations here. I'm not going to go through all of it right now, but the main considerations are, do you have copyright clearance to share these materials? Are there privacy or other ethical considerations? For example, we've done a few projects, quite a few projects with SUNY Upstate, and they have some wonderful materials that, as you can imagine, HIPAA would frown upon. So there are ethical considerations for some collections as well. And then I've linked here, and I will send these slides out after the fact, so you can click on the link later, to the New York Heritage Digital Collections Policy. This goes through in greater depth what New York Heritage specifically is looking for. Not all projects that apply for Access Digitization Grants need to end up in New York Heritage, but it might give you a good sense of generally what we're looking for. And then the next question is how to tackle a project. So what's the best way to process them? Do you have staff that you would be able to devote to the project in-house? Do you need to put them out to a vendor, whether that be CLRC or an independent vendor, to do the work? And there are a few factors here. I divided up into three main areas. Material factors: what are the materials? What are the conditions? What are they are you able to handle it with the equipment you have? And then the next thing is staffing. So do you have the time and the talent? Do you have the staff time to devote to it and the expertise amongst your staff to do it effectively? And then also the big question, especially from a metadata standpoint, is how much do you know about this collection? What is that going to look like? Are you going to have to do a lot of research, or is this going to be pretty straightforward from that standpoint? And then the big question, of course, especially if you're here looking at applying for a grant, is how much will it cost? And how much your institution is able to shoulder, if anything, or if this is really something that you can only do if you have an outside funder, such as a grant like this. So again, this could be a whole webinar on project planning, but I just wanted to bring these things up because these are usually the first 3 main questions that I ask or I talk to people through when they're coming to me with a project idea. So now that we've gotten that preliminary stuff out of the way, I want to do a really quick contextualization of what these Access and Digitization Grants are. So CLRC is one of 9 library councils throughout the state, and we serve a 4-county region here in central New York. And we receive regional bibliographic database funding from the state that helps fund a variety of our activities, but a portion of this, typically around 40,000, we set aside for member grants. So these Access and Digitization Grants that come from that 40,000 we set aside. So this is, we have a certain amount of limitations based on how this money can be used based on our regulations from the state. And this is also a part of a larger pool of money that we do a lot of things with, a lot of continuing education, paying for the actual repositories and the work. And this is just a piece of that puzzle. An important consideration because of how our funding is and our service structure. In order to be eligible for Access and Digitization Grants, your organization needs to be a member of CLRC. For all the public libraries, you're often a member, public and school librarians, you're a member through your public library system or your school library system. And then beyond that, for the small organizations, you need to be at least an affiliate member. So we have a $40 heritage membership that basically gets your foot in the door and gives you an opportunity to participate in a lot of our repositories, but we really want folks to be at the affiliate level or higher. Affiliate memberships are currently $110 a year. So we're not talking about a lot of money per se, especially considering if you successfully apply for a grant, you can get that money back and then some. But that is an important consideration if you're looking at applying for a grant and you are already a member. All right, so we've divided the Access and Digitization Grant application up into 4 major categories. And these basically end up being questions that are tailored to these types of projects. It's all coming out of the same pool of money. And I'm putting them all on one slide here so you can see all 4 at once, but I'm going to go in greater depth into all 4 of them. So I'm not going to explain them right now. So first of all, digitization grants. So this is, from a technical standpoint, you're converting analog or physical resources into digital objects. So this is the process of scanning or digitizing media so that it can be accessible online in our repositories. This can be a very wide variety of materials. We see a lot of yearbooks, we see a lot of photograph collections, but we would also be open to multimedia collections, audiovisual, et cetera. Although some of those projects get a little more complicated, and that's when you definitely want to bring a vendor in. Digitization projects almost invariably involve the creation of metadata as well. So because these grants are focused on access, if you digitize a collection of photographs and then you don't create the metadata, or in other words, if you, metadata is the data about data. It's a description about the objects you're digitizing. If you don't create those descriptions, then it's impossible for anybody to find the materials, and they don't fit into any repositories. So the metadata is a big part of these projects, and it's often a big part of the time that it takes, depending on what the materials are. And as I mentioned before, materials for digitization really need to be somewhere publicly accessible. So New York Heritage is the obvious answer for most people. But if your institution is large enough or fortunate enough to have your own repository, then that would be acceptable as well, as long as it's not behind a paywall, and as long as anybody from the general public can access it. So that might apply for a couple people, but by and large, we expect that things be put in New York Heritage. Metadata metadata projects are essentially the second half of the previous set of projects. So you might have materials that were already digitized, and you just need to create metadata to make them accessible. This might be an existing collection that's in one repository, or like just on a hard drive somewhere, and you want to make it available somewhere like New York Heritage. So you could apply for a metadata grant just for the process of creating the metadata. The stuff would already be digitized. And just to clarify, because I had this come up in the past, if you apply for a digitization grant, we assume you're doing the metadata as part of that. You wouldn't then need to apply for a metadata grant to go along with your digitization grant. You'd write the one grant for digitization. If you're starting at square one, you'd write that grant, and then you might mention the metadata aspects of your project in that grant. There's no need to apply twice. So yeah, that's metadata. These are fewer than we have fewer of these than digitization grants, but there's still an important set of projects. Retrospective conversion. This is hopefully we're done with this, and if we aren't, we're still committed to doing these projects. Essentially, this is upgrading collections that are cataloged in a physical card catalog to a digital access system. So to our knowledge, all the public libraries are now fully online. We have had some smaller collections from other institutions come through and ask for money in this category. And there's a couple of big caveats here. It's important that you use the calculation that's dictated to us by the state. So if you're cataloging non-unique records, you would put in for $1 per record. So that's materials that are ubiquitous, books that are in OCLC, or you're copy cataloging them. If you're doing unique records, this would be more applying to a special collections or set of materials that aren't ubiquitous. Then you would calculate it at $10 per record. This does not support cataloging of new acquisitions. This is only for existing collections that are in a physical card catalog and you want to put them online. So again, I hope we don't have any more of these. I hope that we're fully online as a region, but we are leaving it up just in case there are more materials. So if you have a physical card catalog still, let us know and we can work with you to do that. And the fourth category, it might seem a little redundant from the first, newspaper digitization. I have this as a separate category because we really want to encourage more newspaper digitization projects, and this track of the application is simpler and more attuned to what kinds of things we need to know about newspapers specifically. So that's why there's a separate category. This might be that you're digitizing from microfilm or from a physical, bound or in boxes, physical copies of the newspaper. And then anything in this category, we expect that you would put it up in New York State historic newspapers, even if you're going through a vendor like Advantage Preservation that has their own hosting that they offer as part of the package. We would still expect that these materials also end up in New York State historic newspapers. Northern New York, which is our partner council to the north, is able to do digitization from microfilm. So if that's what you're digitizing from, we would expect it would be worth getting a quote from them. They would charge 15 cents per page, and then you would just mail them the reels and they would do the rest. So that's a really good option. All right, so moving on. And again, if you have any questions about any of this, feel free to add it to chat, and I will slow down a bit. So these unsupported expenses are mostly dictated to us by the RBDB funding that these grants come from. We're not supposed to use this funding for overhead costs. So while some grants allow for a certain percentage to be used for this category, this is not part of Access Digitization Grants. So no rent, heat, electricity. These funds also aren't intended to pay for current acquisitions. So we're not, these grants aren't to buy historical materials that you would digitize. It's to process materials you have currently. Courier costs, this is a big one. So if you need to ship materials to a vendor, then that's usually not a large cost, at least relative to the rest of the project, but this is something that you would want to estimate and make sure that your institution could cover these costs, even if you don't cover any other costs. And of course, if you're delivering stuff to CLRC, we would just pick it up or arrange a way to get it from you. So that wouldn't be a cost anyway. So it doesn't cover ILL costs, integrated library systems. So the very limited software support from these funds. And then another important consideration is these grants are intended to increase your capacity as an institution. So we're not funding your current staff hours. If you have part-time workers, you might increase their hours and use a grant to pay for that increase. Or if you have volunteers, you might pay volunteers instead of having them work for nothing. So this is a consideration when you're applying for the grant, that we're increasing your capacity. We're not just subsidizing your current work. And then, of course, I mentioned this several times throughout this. We're not able to fund things that you don't have copyright clearance for, because if you don't have copyright clearance, then you shouldn't be putting it up in a repository. And that's kind of the whole point of these grants, is to make your resources more publicly accessible. So that's an important unsupported expense. All right, so excuse me. All right, so a few pointers for what makes for a successful application. Well thought out project plans are important. I'm very impressed when we go through a review and there's a project that's thought of everything and shows us the breakdown where they get their numbers. This also helps to minimize the back and forth about us clarifying stuff, where we're not, the better we understand your logic and your thinking, especially when you're coming up with numbers, staff hours, et cetera, the better we're able to just go ahead and say yes, instead of having to question and go back. Detailed, reasonable budgets. This goes very much with the first point. The more detailed your budget, the better we understand where you're spending the funding you're asking for. And then this is something that I'm really emphasizing this year. I really want to see all copyright and vendor documentation, so vendor quotes and permission letters and all that, before you submit your application, or at least simultaneous to submitting your application. That way, again, we don't have to go back and request this after the fact. Okay, and then for repeat applicants, we want to see that you've, of course, this year has been crazy. So really, we want to see good faith attempts to complete your previous projects on time, and your reporting and all of that. Large projects can be split across multiple years. So if you have a project that is pushing up against our upper limits for what we are willing to fund, which is typically around 10,000, but we're less likely to fund projects to that level because we want to share our funding around to as many folks as possible. But you can apply for a grant and then the first part of a project, and then next year apply for the next part, and that's fully appropriate. We recognize that, and it's more realistic in some cases, because if you're trying to do a very large project and you don't get to it, then you have to either scramble or change plans later on, and we'd rather see folks bite off a manageable portion of a project and go from there. And then you can see on our website what projects have been funded in the past and how much. And that might give you a sense for what you might ask for. Okay, so the next thing I want to discuss is our capacity at CLRC to do digitization projects and metadata projects on your behalf. So this service grew out of a realization that a lot of folks were having trouble applying for these grants because they don't have the staffing or the time to hire staff, and a lot of the friction for people trying to get these projects off the ground was that they don't have the capacity. And also on the flip side, when you're looking at a lot of vendor quotes, and we really encourage folks to get quotes from outside vendors, a lot of those vendor quotes end up coming back pretty high for the work that's being done. Some materials, if you have the Gutenberg Bible, you don't want us doing it. I mean, I'll be completely honest about that. We're professional. We can handle most materials, but something that's especially fragile or needs special care, then that really should be sent to a vendor. But for a yearbook, some of the vendors were coming back with very high yearbook digitization costs. So we were trying to find a way to do this in-house. And we have 2 book scanners, and I hope to set up a copy stand tomorrow in the office. So we'll be able to do some more large format digitization. So the way to go about getting a quote for this, I really need to know the quantity of materials that you have as close as you can estimate. So like if you have a collection of yearbooks, for instance, I don't expect you to go through every single one and verify how many pages there are. But if you look and say, okay, most of them are about 200 pages and we have 100 of them, then we know you have 20,000 pages. So like that's a perfectly sufficient estimation. It's really important to know what kind of condition they're in. So are they bound volumes? If they're bound volumes, how close to the margin, how close is the text and the content into the margin? That can be a really big factor in our ability to digitize. And then the size. So our book scanners can only support so large of materials. And I'm hopeful for this copy stand, it's going to be a lot better for flat objects. So maps, posters, stuff like that will hopefully be good for that. But bound volumes, it won't be as effective for in theory. So yeah, if you have all that information and then you shoot me an email before January 15th, then I can give a quote for what it would take to do the project. And the benefit of having us do the project on your behalf is the work that is involved in the project is basically you writing the grant, preparing the materials for us, getting the materials to us. We do all the digitization. We do as much metadata as we can. Oftentimes we have to get additional help with that, especially if it's a photograph collection and you're the experts of your collection. But otherwise we do the metadata and then we do the upload. So, and then we give the materials back to you. So essentially this is a way for institutions that don't have a lot of staff capacity, or they don't have the expertise or the equipment, and you send the materials to us. We do the work at cost essentially, and then we get it up and ready for you. So it takes a lot of the burden off of all of you who are busy, especially with whatever this coming year has in store for us. But it's really important that you ask for a quote with enough time before the application that I'm able to clarify anything that needs clarifying, and then give you a number that you can plug into the grant application. I think there was anything I'm missing on this. But yeah, I very much welcome these projects. We do between like 5 and 10 per year or so. And the earlier you get in with a quote, the earlier you apply, then the earlier you are in our queue when we go to do the work. Okay, so as kind of a recap, and as to maybe make this a little bit less theoretical, I'm going to go through some project examples from the last few years. First of all, digitization projects. We recently completed this on behalf of Hamilton Public Library. We digitized the high school student newspapers, the Emerald Press, and I believe they ended up in New York State Historic Newspapers. So we took the newspapers, we did all the digitization and metadata, we got them ready, and we sent the physical copies back to Hamilton. And it's worked really well. We've been doing more newspapers. I'd say our most common project is yearbooks. We did a ton of yearbook projects over the last 3 years. But we're also we're capable of doing newspapers as long as they're relatively flat and they are not too large, because they'll fit on our scanning bed. So an example of a metadata project, this is also an example of a project that's been going on for a few years. I think they're in their third. They've Skinny-Alice Historical Society has applied 3 years running to fund this project to complete metadata on a photograph collection that they're building. So this is an example where one of their volunteers has been diligently scanning photographs at home over the last few years. So they have a large backlog of photographs, but not the metadata in order to put them up in New York Heritage. So this is something that they're doing in-house, although it just so happens that the woman who is doing the metadata for them is also our project assistant, Ashley Beavers. So she works for both us and them, and so she does a great job with metadata, and she's been working through their metadata backlog for the last several years. Retrospective conversion, like I said, this is hopefully a obsolete project category, but the last one we did was Holy Trinity Seminary. They found some materials in their collection that still hadn't been moved online. The records hadn't been moved online, so they applied for, this was 2 years ago, I want to say, and got a grant to finish their retrospective conversion. So we had funded them several years prior, and then they found this, and hopefully they're done, and hopefully everybody else is. But if you need more information about these grants, just shoot me an email. Newspaper digitization, we've been doing more and more of these. This is a good example from SUNY Polytechnic Institute. they recognized that there was an underrepresentation of newspapers from Utica in New York State historic newspapers. So they applied for a portion of a large set of materials. Utica Observer is their most recent one, but I believe they have a couple other titles they're going to be working on. So this is something where they applied for a first year of the project, and then I hope and expect to see them apply for the next year coming up this round. So there's more examples of projects on our grant website, but these are just 4 that outline a few of the pertinent things I've been talking about in prior slides. Okay, so general timeline and process for this whole rigmarole. The first deadline of sorts is January 15th. I really would appreciate if everybody who wants a consultation from me at least schedules it reaches out before the 15th to schedule. Doesn't mean we have to meet before the 15th. I just want to make sure that I'm not getting a bunch of requests to have one-on-one meetings the day before the application is due. So just reach out and let me know. Even if you're on this webinar and you just want more direct information about what your project is and how it fits into this, and advice about how to manage any portion of the grant application, feel free to email me. I'm happy to meet with each and every one of you. So just try to do so before the 15th, so I'm not like bombarded at the last minute. And then the 15th is also when I would appreciate if you would like a quote from CLRC to do the digitization work at our Dig Lab, that you request it before the 15th. That gives us enough time to work out the details and make sure that it's all set. And I have a number for you before the applications are due. Speaking of which, the applications are due the last Friday in January, which this year, that says the wrong thing, doesn't it? Well, this should be, hold on. Yeah, no, I do have the wrong years. Okay. I think I started this presentation long enough. So yeah, January 29th, 2021 is the deadline, and January 15th, 2021 is the prior deadline that I was referring to for the consult and the quote. So this slide is wrong. I'll fix it when I send it back out. But yeah, the application deadline is January 29th, 2021. And this is, if you have any questions at the last minute, feel free to email me, but, we'll, right after we get all the applications in, I'll start reviewing them, taking a first pass. One thing I don't think I mentioned on a prior slide that I meant to was that how the grants are decided. So the way it's, excuse me, the way it's structured for us, our staff does not have any say in who gets grants for this program. We have a committee made up of members, the Library Resources and Services Committee, that does the bulk of the recommendation work for who should get funded and how much. And I also have this, their recommendations read through by an external review panel. This is just a couple of my colleagues from around the state, just to point out anything that we might have missed being too close to it. And then and that should all happen in February. And then in March, the March CLRC board meeting, we would put the recommendations of that committee in front of the board. The board will vote on it, hopefully approve all the recommendations. And then as soon as that is approved, as quickly as I can, I will let all of you know that you are hopefully recipients of our next round of grants. And that should be in April. Although, it says, wow, this is really, I really needed to fix this slide. April 2010, yeah, it'd be nice if you could go back go back 10 years and find out before you even thought of the project. Yeah, so I will fix this in the setup I send out. But yeah, April 2021 is when you should find out. And then the rest of the dates are actually correct. January 31st, 2021. So a year after you submitted the grant. I'd like to have the grant year will go from when you find out we announce the grant winners until June of the following year. So June 22. And midway through it, January 31st of 22, I have you fill out an interim report, which is basically, you know, how are things going? You know, do you need any extra support from us? It's not like neither one of these reports are very strenuous, but they just help us document your successes and, you know, what we might want to consider in the future. So this, I apologize for this slide being so screwed up. I will fix it when I send it back out. All right. So I'm going to dive right into the application. And before I do so, I'm just going to take a quick detour and point out, if you go to our website, all the resources available on our website for this grant. This webinar recording will end up here along with the slides. If you click through all these are the, it's a Word doc that you can edit and type your answers in to the questions. So it's kind of a good way to prepare for the grant application. And then this is the actual application link, which is a Google form. Unfortunately, Google Forms do not allow you to save and go back. So you have to fill it out all at once and then hit submit. So that's why I make the worksheets available, so you can gather your thoughts there and then go through and paste them into the application, or you know, type them in there either way. And of course, if you have questions. And we have the program timeline with the correct dates. And then again, some of the examples from previous years of what we had, what we've given out. So that gives you a sense for what we have done in the past. Okay, so now I'm going to go through, I'm going to do this pretty quickly, but our application. So for those of you who have applied in the past, there are a couple of new questions. So I'll point those out as well. So in the beginning of the application, there's 14 questions that you answer no matter which type of application you're applying for. The first few questions are mostly contact information and knowing who you are. You can apply for multiple projects in one grant year. So if you have a collection of photographs and a collection of yearbooks, you can apply for each project separately, and also let us know what your importance, which one you'd rank higher. So you can let us know, if we aren't able to fund both your projects, which is the one that you prefer that we fund. So that's that you can indicate that there. We do welcome cooperative projects. So this is a good example. If you are working with a partner who may not be a member, or they might be a member, but like you're pooling collection resources, or you're pooling other resources or expertise or anything. We've had Manlius Library apply with Manlius Historical Society a few years now. And you know, the library is working to help the Historical Society digitize their materials. And of course, you can answer, you attend the training session or you've watched it. If you've gotten this far, you're check that box. We want to know a title of the project, which just helps us track and keep track of what project is yours. And this is a new question. The next one is a new question. We are recognizing that New York Heritage site-wide, and I'd say really the archival record as a whole has a representation issue. So I really would like to see more materials and collections that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. So This is not a required question. This is not a requirement to receive a grant, but we really want to encourage and give space for people who are working on projects that will help broaden the spectrum of the historic record. So, you know, we welcome projects that help to promote and better depict underrepresented populations, however you want to interpret that. But this is, I think, especially important this year. But you know, we have an opportunity to right that wrong. All right, and then the final question before we split off is category funding. So these are the 4 categories that we've mentioned previously. And from here, excuse me. From here, we end up, the form kind of turns into a choose your own adventure. So depending on which category of funding you choose, your next page of the application will give you the questions tailored to that category. So first we'll go through digitization metadata. These 2 categories, incidentally, we have the same set of questions for it. I think it used to be separate, but ended up being so much overlap that it wasn't worth separating. So we go through some initial questions that are really trying to suss out what you're trying to do with this project, how you're hoping to do it. You know, why is your intended approach the best way to accomplish these goals? Any training needs you might have. Of course, through my support role, in my position, I would help in any way I could to teach you how to do digitization, give you feedback on metadata, any step of the process. But you know, it's helpful to see this here so we know what your project what kind of support your project will need. Or you know, if you're doing it through a vendor, you might not need support. Like that might be kind of a moot point. Then we really want to see what you're projecting the impact of your project to be, and how you hope to evaluate that, and you know, support the project going forward. So these are all like questions that will help us get a better picture of how you see this project being impactful and how you see it, how you're gonna, you know, take stock of that at the end. So the next few questions are related to copyright. So again, it's really important that you consider on an item by item basis what the copyright status of the materials are and get permissions where necessary. So if you're digitizing a set of school yearbooks, it would be appropriate to reach out to the school and get their permission, assuming that it's a work for hire for the school district. They would be the copyright holders. Or if you're digitizing a set of paintings, you would need to go and ask the permission of the artists, and all that work. And that takes a little bit of time. So that might be something to consider pretty early in the process. And then I want to see documentation of that. That's often, I want to see a written letter or written set of evidence that you have their permission, and it's not just a verbal handshake deal. And that'll be helpful later on if we have any issues. And then where will the materials be available? So we would hope that, or we would expect most materials to end up in New York Heritage, but it's also, again, possible that you put it in your own repository if you have one. As long as it's publicly accessible, that's our main concern. And of course, you know, you can also duplicate materials in multiple places. Just because it ends up in New York Heritage doesn't mean you can't post them on your website or elsewhere. But we want to make sure that you're getting the materials out and they're having that impact in the community. The next set of questions are budget related. So we have a bunch of categories here. Many of these categories aren't relevant to most projects. One thing that bears mentioning, we don't typically offer funding for individual institutions to buy scanning equipment. So if you need a microphone, if you need a scanner, if you need a camera, if you need any of those materials, that's something that you can reach out to me and ask. We have a lot of those things available. Actually, all the things I just listed, we have available to be borrowed. And we typically do it that way so that when we're buying a scanner, when you're done with the project, we can have somebody else use the scanner, and that helps us stretch the money and the resources further. But on the other hand, it might be appropriate if you don't have sufficient storage to store backups of the materials to then ask for an external hard drive or some other storage media that will help you preserve your digital files, and that would be appropriate. If you have any questions about any of this, please let me know. Really, the biggest thing you see here is the personnel. Like, we have questions about personnel. So if it's not clear that you're asking for money to pay for additional staff time, then that's 9 times out of 10 the question I end up having to come back to applicants with to clarify that. The better you can express that in advance, the easier it will be for our LRS committee to give you a thumbs up without having to do a lot of back and forth. Oh, and my note at the top, I want to acknowledge as well, there's no requirement that there's a cost share for these grants. So if your institution is contributing staff time as in-kind donation or something like that, you might want to quantify that, but there's no reason to say that you're pitching in a portion of a project unless you have a desire or a means to do so. So please don't feel like you need to add a cost share. That's an option for all these categories, but it's not a requirement. Again, one time when you would really need a cost share for a specific instance is courier costs. So if you're shipping something, then you would need to find another way to pay for that besides our grants, because of how our funding structure is. All right, so retrospective conversion, again, I don't expect to see any applicants for this category of funding, but really there's a couple questions about quantity of records and what percentage is copy catalog versus unique records. That's kind of it. I mean, you use your calculation from the earlier slide where $1 per ubiquitous records and $10 per unique records, and you calculate it out, and that's pretty much it. You might use a vendor, you might have other means of doing this, but it's really what it comes down to. Newspaper digitization, as I mentioned previously, this is really just tailored to be questions that are specific to newspapers to make it easier for folks to apply for newspapers. So we want to know the titles and date ranges. So, you might have a number of years from one title and then a number of years from another title, or a gap or something like that. And this just helps us understand what you're hoping to digitize. And, why are these materials important? So this gets back to that, the importance of it being of interest beyond your institution. So we'd be less likely to digitize internal memos versus, things that are important to the broader New York State community. Documentation of copyright permission again. Then we want to know your quantity. This might be in reels, this might be in boxes, this is very often an estimation, but quantify how much you have in whatever unit is easiest and most readily accessible. If you're using a vendor, which typically you would for a newspaper digitization project, we want to know the name of your vendor. And where will they be available? This is kind of a leading question. They all need to end up in New York State historic newspapers, but they might end up other places as well. And then we want you to describe and quantify your expenses. All right, I'm we're kind of nearing the end here, so I'm getting up to the end of my hour, so I'm gonna run through the rest really quickly here. There's a final set after the choose your own adventure section of the application. There's a final set of questions that everybody answers at the end. And these are very helpful. So we want to know if you'll accept partial funding. This is often something we do go back to, especially if we have more requests that outstrip our available funding for these grants. But if you are able to accept partial funding, this is often you'll digitize, you'll process, you'll do less of the project, and you can apply the next year. That'd be kind of the general answer we would see. But it's helpful to know if there are things that are fixed costs that you can't have half a hard drive, but you could digitize half of a run of newspapers. So I think it's important to explain this, because we do often go to this question when we're reviewing. And then if there's anything else you want to tell us that didn't fit anywhere else in the application. So if there's something that you'd like us to know that's pertinent to your application, then please tell us. And we do have character limits on a lot of these questions, if not all of them. And a lot of that's just to make sure that it forces you to be succinct, because if you write 2 pages for an answer, then it might not be read as thoroughly as a concise paragraph answer. So sometimes if you just have something else you want to tell us, you can tell us there. And finally, this is a new question. Again, just confirming that all the necessary documentation has been sent via email. This is also kind of your checkoff that you've done all these things, and your application is complete. And then after your application is complete, the system is set up so that you will receive a PDF copy of your application. So you'll be able to see exactly what you submitted to us. So that's a FYI, if you'll have it for your records after the fact. All right, I just ran through a lot of information, and I didn't see really any questions during my talk. So I will be hanging on for a little while, and feel free to add questions in chat. And if you have specific questions about, or that might be more specific to your materials that you're hoping to digitize, do metadata for, etc., feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to have more in-depth conversations about that as well. Yeah, and well, I'm hoping to get another good round of applications this year. While our funding from the state was cut by around 20%, we currently plan to give our usual $40,000 in grants, and I think that should be doable. We have no expectation that we'll be giving out less, but again, answering some of those questions about partial funding and being clear about what you're using the funding for will really help us if we do end up with more applications than we have funding. But just as a way of encouragement, we also, I'd say we've, in the last 3 or 4 years that I've been involved in this process, we've only denied a couple of applicants, and that's because they were somewhat off base in their request. So, well, I can't give any guarantees. I will say that we do our best to fund every worthy project in some capacity. And because I don't make the decisions, I can help advocate for you. So the more you explain to me what you're after, the more I can help the LRS committee understand your application. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so I will say that is it. If you have a question, I guess type it fast. Otherwise, thank you all so much for attending. And I will be posting this recording as soon as I am able, and you can review back, and I'll also post an updated and fixed version of the slides. Thank you, everyone. I assume no questions means I explained everything in great detail. All right. Bye, everyone. Take care. Stay safe. Have a wonderful holidays.